Orks in some Space Marine armor is already a fun concept, not to mention just was a ton of fun to make. So the moment I finished that, I naturally thought of, you know what else is awesome? Terminator armor. So we need to combine the two and put some Orks in Terminator armor. And because the new Terminator armor no longer has the, very hunched over looking effect, I decided to go with the old Terminator armor of the Chaos variety just for that extra flavor. I started off with picking out my favorite looking Chaos Terminator body and this orky arm holding this very big choppa. It mixed up a bit of green stuff as most of the project will be very dependent on it. As this was a Chaos Terminator, I naturally picked the head with a top knot. The only modification I did to this Chaos armor was removing the Chaos trim above his neck area. This was because the old Terminator armor already has a very hunched over looking effect, so I didn't have to do any modifications to try and match that. I just put a little bit of green stuff in there to create the idea of his massive neck. When I began smoothing out the different lines on his neck, I did try to create a few folds in there. Hopefully again creating the visual emphasis on the fact that this armor is just far too small for this massive boss. When attaching his arms, I decided to use the exact same cheat that I used in the Ultra Waaagh, which is to create the illusion of these very massive, almost like burlap sack sleeves coming out of the armor itself. This has a bunch of benefits for someone like me who's not good at sculpting, and it allows me to create the idea that he has just much more of a hulking presence, matching of a proper boss. Then I also don't have to worry about creating a perfect transition between the armor and the arm itself, but nonetheless, I still tried to use the sculpting tool to create something that resembled a fabric, not just some green stuff on its own. With me not having a specific idea for what this project was going to be, I looked at his head and realized that there was a specific pose for his arm that I thought would be a great match for it. Fortunately, I was able to fill in the massive gap that was essentially inside of that arm connecting to the body itself. When I finally placed his arm and looked over his face, I couldn't help but feel that his facial expression and everything combined made it seem like he was letting out this massive Waaagh and rallying the Orks around him. Then I moved on to the shoulder pads and realized that I had absolutely no Terminator shoulders left, so instead I actually ended up using the Primaris Gravis Armor shoulder pads instead, and frankly I think it worked out a lot better. This helped further reinforce the idea that this orc just really likes trophies and gathering all this stuff from opponents that he found worthy. With the second pad placed on him, I felt like there was something missing from him. Then I realized that bosses usually carry these massive totem poles on their back, so I found a perfect match for it. It also came with a very interesting slugga that now gives my boss a ranged option in combat. To further complement his interesting pose, I decided to place him on top of the Firstborn power pack. To avoid cutting into the model, I placed him on top of some green stuff, which will hopefully create the idea that he's simply standing on some sort of a rock. And I couldn't help but give him another trophy. Originally, I was gonna go for a Primaris looking helmet, however, I thought that a Terminator one would be just a far better match and be much more interesting story-wise, as taking out multiple Terminators is a worthy feat and something a war boss can brag about to his boys. Now, it might just be me, but it kinda looks like this guy resembles the war boss in Mega Armor. It could just be the fact that they both have a big choppa, but there's just something about them that makes me feel like they're very similar. Maybe if I used a different base size, I could have gone with that, but for now, this guy's just a normal boss that happens to resemble the other one. When I finally primed the model, I didn't realize that I had no idea what colors I wanted to paint him in. So I decided to try something. I used the process of elimination and I began coloring in all the parts that I had the idea for what they were going to be. So I used a bit of this orange color to showcase that all of the Space Marines he defeated were Imperial Fists, and used the exact same green that I used for the previous Space Orks. For his armor color, I chose to go for Anthracite as I really did not just want to leave it as pure black. Even though black armor always looks super awesome, at the same time it's also a little bit boring to paint. But I wanted a color that also at least slightly resembled one of the Chaos Legions. So with this dark blue being just a very small resemblance to the Night Lords, and tying it all together with a lot of red to complement the other colors. Going with this process of elimination actually helped out a lot with the story the armor of this orc was supposed to tell. Not to mention, it was just a lot more fun not being limited by a color scheme. Painting the skin, I used a lot more of a volumetric highlight just to make the muscles stand out a lot better and just pop off the miniature. But for the reds, I ended up using the exact same recipe that I used on the red Space Orc just to make sure that he didn't feel out of place when placed next to them. Because I enjoyed the very simple look of his armor, I chose to put emphasis and details in other parts of his model. With red being the most attention-grabbing color of them all, it felt like a natural candidate for just putting a lot more details into it. For the yellow, even though originally I wanted to keep that very orangey looking sunset yellow, it did not feel Imperial Fist enough, so I began transitioning the yellow into a much more of a paler color that you often see on them. And to tie him in with the Ultra Waaagh, I decided to use the exact same cross-hatching on the yellow shoulder pads. With all of my recent models, I also started to transition away from using skeletal horde for all of my skeletal pieces, and experimenting with a bunch of different recipes for what the bone color could look like. This time I ended up using the exact same rubber black that I used for his weapon and all of the other details, and simply adding just a little bit of ice yellow to it. With this war boss having so many vibrant bright colors, I also used some of the frog green that I often use on other orc skin colors to just brighten them up a little bit. And for the metallic trim, going for this very nice bronze looking color. Then to provide some additional depth to my model, I mixed in a very thin version of my favorite acrylic wash, and used a massive amount of flow improver just to make sure there was going to be no staining effects on any of the armor panels. With most of the model painted up, I felt like there was just a little bit lacking on his weapon to draw the eye towards it. So I had an idea to provide an OSL effect, but the only place I could think of was essentially these cables coming from his weapon. I sketched out the areas where I wanted the light to be concentrated, then I airbrushed a teal contrast paint expecting that to be it. However, the result just did not look as good as I wanted to. So for the final detail, I ended up spending a bit of time with this OSL effect and hopefully got it to a pretty decent looking place. The only thing left to do was to base the miniatures, and I got a ton of great suggestions, and I sort of decided to combine a few of my favorite ones together and essentially create the idea that these space orcs are on some sort of a very cold, snowy mountain that has this very black obsidian rock underneath it. And for the space orc in the Terminator armor, I also gave him a little bit of a mini diorama base just to make him even more awesome. And I think the final result turned out just even more awesome than I wanted to. So with that, let's see the final result. So thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, consider leaving a like, and for now, I'll see you next time.